There is a place on the seafloor that scientists call a barren. The rock is bare. The water above it runs strangely clear because almost nothing is growing there to cloud it. Packed across the stone, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 100 to a square yard, are sea urchins, and they do essentially one thing. They grind. Anything green that tries to take hold gets stripped back down to the rock long before it reaches the height of a human hand. For most of the 20th century, along long stretches of the North Pacific coast, this was simply what the bottom of the ocean looked like. Fishermen knew it. Divers who went down in the 1950s came back up and described it without any particular alarm, because nobody alive had ever seen that coastline look like anything else. It was not recorded as damage. It was the baseline. Then, in July of 1969, a plane landed on the Washington coast carrying 29 animals in wooden crates. Within a single human lifetime, the water off that shoreline would hold something nobody in the state had seen in 6 decades. A forest, anchored to bare rock, climbing 60 feet toward the surface, bending with the swell. Nobody planted it. It arrived on its own, and the forest was only the first thing to change. Underneath it, beside it, and eventually 1,000 miles away from it, a chain of consequences began moving through fish and seabirds and seagrass and the carbon in the atmosphere itself. Tracing that chain would take scientists another 40 years, and the final link would turn up somewhere nobody was looking. The people who pushed for that release believed they were saving a species from disappearing. They were, but that was the smallest part of what they had just done, because the animal inside those crates did more than live in the kelp forest. It built it. Bering Island, 1741. A Russian expedition under Vitus Bering has come apart on a treeless rock in the middle of the North Pacific. The captain is dying. Most of the crew is dying with him, of scurvy and cold and slow starvation. Among the survivors is a young German naturalist named Georg Steller, who spends the winter doing the only thing he knows how to do, which is write down everything he sees. What he sees in the surf are animals with no fear of people at all. They float on their backs in the kelp. They crack shellfish open on stones balanced across their own chests. And their fur is unlike anything in Europe. A sea otter has no blubber. It survives in water hovering around 40 degrees on insulation alone. And that insulation is a coat carrying close to 1 million hairs in every square inch. A human head carries about 100,000 hairs in total. An otter has 10 times that inside a patch the size of a postage stamp, in 2 layers that trap a permanent film of air against the skin. It spends roughly 1/10 of its waking life combing that coat, because the day it stops grooming is the day it starts to freeze. Steller wrote about something else that winter, a slow, grazing animal in the shallows, 30 feet long, weighing as much as 10 tons, feeding on kelp. No European had ever recorded it. Within 27 years of the day he described it, the last one was dead, and the species now known as Steller's sea cow was gone forever. Hold on to that, because it comes back later, and when it does, it will mean something different than it does right now. When the survivors finally rowed a makeshift boat back to Kamchatka, they carried roughly 900 sea otter pelts with them. That cargo was worth a fortune. Word traveled fast. What followed became one of the longest sustained commercial hunts in recorded history. Russian fur crews pushed east across the Aleutians, then into Alaska, then California, coercing Aleut hunters into doing the killing for them. British and American ships joined by the 1780s. The trade ran 170 years, from northern Japan to Baja California, and it did not slow down as the animals grew scarce. It accelerated because scarcity raised the price. In the 1880s, a single pelt brought roughly $150 in London. By 1903, one could bring more than 1,100. Before the ships arrived, the North Pacific probably held somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 sea otters. By 1911, there were 13 scattered colonies left. Each one held somewhere between 10 and 100 animals. Worldwide, perhaps 1 or 2,000 remained alive. That year, Russia, Japan, Great Britain, and the United States signed a treaty banning the hunt. It was the first international agreement ever written to protect a wild species. It arrived about a decade too late for Washington. The last sea otter known to have been killed in the state was taken at Willapa Bay in 1910. Pulling a predator out of a coastline does not leave a hole behind. The system closes around the absence and keeps running, and that is exactly what makes the damage so difficult to see. Sea urchins eat kelp. That is most of what an urchin does with its life. On a coastline with otters in it, urchins spend their days wedged into cracks in the rock, staying small, staying hidden, feeding on scraps that drift past. Remove the predator and the arithmetic changes overnight. The urchins come out of the cracks. They move across open rock in a slow front, and they do not eat the blades floating at the surface. They eat the holdfast, the root-like grip pinning each plant to the seafloor. Cut that, and a 60-foot organism drifts away and dies. What makes a barren permanent rather than temporary comes next. Once the kelp is gone, the urchins do not starve and die off, which would let the forest return. They shrink. Their reproductive tissue withers to almost nothing, their metabolism drops, and they sit on the bare rock in a kind of suspended state, waiting, eating whatever scraps arrive. They can hold that position for decades. Any kelp spore that settles gets eaten as a seedling. The barren is not a wound healing over. It is a second, entirely stable version of the same coastline, and it locks. Everything the forest had been carrying went with it. Kelp is not a plant that happens to live in the ocean. It is a structure that builds one. It shelters juvenile rockfish and greenling, it slows incoming swell before the swell reaches the beach, and it feeds an enormous food web, both directly and as drifting detritus that sinks into total darkness. When the forest went, the fish thinned out. Then the seabirds that ate the fish shifted their diets, and the eagles that ate the seabirds shifted theirs. Nobody in Washington watched this happen because it finished before anyone thought to measure it. Meanwhile, roughly 2,000 miles northwest, in one of the emptiest places on the planet, a few hundred otters had survived. Amchitka Island sits near the western end of the Aleutian chain, a treeless strip of tundra and rock between the Bering Sea and the open Pacific. It is violently windy, permanently gray, and so remote that the fur ships eventually stopped bothering with it. That remoteness is the only reason there were still sea otters there in the 20th century. By 1965, the Aleutian population had climbed back to roughly what it had been before the hunt began, and then the same remoteness that had saved those animals became the exact reason they had to leave. The United States Atomic Energy Commission was looking for somewhere to detonate very large nuclear weapons underground, somewhere too far from anything to matter. Amchitka fit. The first test, code-named Longshot, went off in 1965. The second was set for the autumn of 1969. It was called Milrow, roughly a megaton, buried 4,000 feet down, and a Defense Department film stated its purpose out loud. Milrow existed to test an island rather than a weapon. The island was Amchitka, and the real question was whether it could survive what was planned for 1971. That one was Kannakin, 5 megatons. The largest underground nuclear detonation the United States has ever carried out. So, in the months before Milrow, biologists began taking sea otters off the island. Some went to southeast Alaska, some went to the Pribilofs, some to Vancouver Island, some to Oregon. And in July of 1969, 3 months before Milrow, 29 of them were crated, loaded onto a plane, and flown to the Olympic coast of Washington, where they were released near Point Grenville into water their species had not touched in almost 60 years. The transport went badly. Of those 29 animals, 16 are known to have died. Some washed up on the beaches within days. The tests went ahead regardless. On the 6th of November, 1971, Kannakin detonated more than a mile beneath Amchitka. The ground surface rose and dropped roughly 20 feet. The shock registered the same as a magnitude 7 earthquake. Cliffs fell into the sea, the water along the shoreline turned to froth, and thousands of seabirds died. So did as many as 1,000 sea otters, killed by the pressure wave in the water they were floating in. Several hundred otters had been flown off that island in the years beforehand, 59 of them to Washington. Around 1,000 were killed anyway. The protest against those tests, incidentally, is where Greenpeace came from. The second Washington release came in July of 1970. 30 more otters, and this time the handlers had learned something. Rather than trucking the animals straight to open water, they held them in a floating enclosure anchored near James Island, just off La Push, and let them recover. The record notes that when they were finally released nearby, they went into the water in excellent condition. That brought the total to 59, 29 at Point Grenville, 30 at La Push, out of a species that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands 2 centuries earlier. Then the state essentially stopped watching. Down in Oregon, the parallel experiment was already failing. 93 otters had been released at Cape Blanco and on the reefs near Port Orford across 1970 and 1971. They scattered, they thinned, sightings dwindled through the decade, and by the early 1980s, Oregon's sea otters were simply gone, with almost no data collected to explain why. Oregon has none today. Nobody ran a proper survey in Washington until 1977. When biologists eventually reconstructed what had happened in those silent years, the number they arrived at was sobering. The entire Washington population, every otter alive on that coast, had descended from somewhere between 10 and 43 surviving founders. The likeliest figure sits near the bottom of that range, possibly 10 animals, a population you could fit in a garage. By 1989, the first full aerial and ground survey counted 208. If a story like this is worth your time, subscribing genuinely helps it reach people who would never have thought to search for it. That is the entire ask. By the early 1970s, while all this was still unfolding, a graduate student named James Estes was diving at Amchitka, trying to work out what sea otters ate and how much. He was at an island with a full otter population, and the seafloor beneath him was forest, dense kelp in every direction, fish moving through it. Then he dove at Shemya, a couple of 100 miles west, where the otters had never come back. Bare rock and urchins as far as his lights would carry. Same latitude, same water, same currents, same species pool, same everything, except for one animal. Estes later said it became clear in an instant. He and a colleague named John Palmisano published it in the journal Science in 1974, and it became one of the foundational papers in modern ecology. Sea otters were not passengers in the kelp forest. They were the load-bearing wall. The otter, the two men wrote, was an evolutionary component essential to the integrity and stability of the whole system. The engine driving it is metabolic. Having no blubber, a sea otter burns calories at roughly twice the rate of a land mammal its size, and to stay alive, it must eat about a quarter of its own body weight every day. For a person weighing 160 pounds, that is 40 pounds of food a day, forever, with no days off. An otter is a machine for converting sea urchins into body heat, and it never stops running. Where they graze, the urchins go back into the cracks. Sunlight reaches bare rock. Kelp spores take hold, the forest climbs, and everything that needs a forest comes back to use it. That much was understood by the mid-1970s. Working out how far the chain actually reached took another 40 years, and the strangest evidence came from a place with no kelp in it at all. Elkhorn Slough is a tidal estuary on the central California coast, wrapped in farmland. Fertilizer use in the watershed climbed from around 200 tons of nitrogen in the 1930s to roughly 30,000 tons by 2005, and all of that runoff ends up in the water. Under that kind of nutrient load, eelgrass dies. Algae blooms across the leaves, blocks the light, and the meadow smothers. It is documented in estuaries all over the world. Then the otters recolonized the slough, and the eelgrass came back, not everywhere. It came back thickest and greenest, exactly where the otters were densest. The otters do not eat algae, and they never touch eelgrass. Researchers led by Brent Hughes published the mechanism in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013, and it runs 5 levels deep. Otters eat crabs. Crabs eat sea slugs and small crustaceans, and those slugs and crustaceans graze algae off eelgrass leaves. Knock the crabs down, and the grazers multiply, and the grazers scrub the leaves clean, and light reaches the eelgrass again. An animal eating crabs at the top of the estuary was canceling out 80 years of farm fertilizer at the bottom of it. Nobody predicted that, because nobody was looking at the crabs. Then there is the carbon. In 2012, Chris Wilmers, James Estes, and their colleagues pooled 40 years of data across roughly 3,300 miles of the North Pacific coast. Forests under otter protection pulled carbon out of the water at up to 12 times the rate of the same coastline stripped to barren. Across the North American range, otters account for somewhere between 4 and 9 million tons of extra carbon locked into living kelp, which is the equivalent of taking 3 to 6 million cars off the road. And now, the sea cow. In 1978, researchers went back through a prehistoric Aleut midden on Amchitka, a refuse heap holding 2,500 years of bones and shells, and read it like a ledger. The prey species changed as the layers rose, and the shift matched what you would expect if the Aleuts had hunted the local otters down, watched the urchins take over, watched the kelp go, and adapted to eating what was left. Urchin barrens are not a modern invention. Humans have been making them in this same ocean for thousands of years. And when the fur crews stripped the otters out of the Commander Islands after 1741, the kelp went with them, and the 10-ton animal that grazed that kelp had nowhere left to feed. The sea cow was hunted, certainly. It may also have been starved by a chain reaction nobody could have described. What that coastline lost in 1910 was a relationship, not an animal. None of which means the story lands cleanly. Around 1990, in the Aleutians, the otters began vanishing again. Of 21 islands surveyed in both 1965 and 1992, counts fell at all but one, by an average of 58%. At Kuluk Bay, the drop hit 76%, and the kelp went with them, densities falling by a factor of 12. The cause, published in Science in 1998, was killer whales. The two species had shared that archipelago for as long as anyone could establish without this happening. What changed was offshore. The seals and sea lions killer whales normally hunt had crashed, and some of the whales appear to have switched to the only marine mammal still abundant near the coast. A sea otter is a poor meal for an animal that size, which is exactly the point. It takes very few whales making that switch to erase an otter population. The chain had one more link than anyone knew, and that link began in the open ocean, in food webs 100 miles from the kelp. The whole system ran in reverse in under 10 years. It is still running in reverse elsewhere. Northern California has no sea otters. In 2013, a wasting disease killed sea stars by the million there, including the sunflower star, the other major predator of purple urchins, and a marine heat wave followed. With no otters and no sea stars, the urchins did what urchins do. More than 95% of the bull kelp canopy vanished along better than 200 miles of coastline, and the abalone fishery closed behind it. Divers are down there now, clearing urchins off the rock by hand. And there is a harder wrinkle, which is that otters are not universally welcome, for reasons that are not stupid. An animal eating a quarter of its body weight daily eats crab, clams, abalone, and urchins, which is to say, it eats fisheries. Where otters return, shellfish harvests generally end. When Oregon debates bringing them home, the people arguing against it are doing arithmetic about their own livelihoods, and that arithmetic is real. Every decision in this story looked practical to somebody at the time. Washington today holds roughly 3,000 sea otters, descended from that handful of survivors. It is a real recovery and a partial one. They occupy about 116 miles of coast, from Point Grenville north to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, while their historic range ran all the way south to the mouth of the Columbia. Most of it is still empty water. Go back to the Barren. The bare rock, the strangely clear water, the urchins packed shoulder to shoulder and grinding, holding a coastline in a state it can hold for a century without any help at all. The thing worth understanding about that place is that it does not look broken. It looks finished. It looks like a coastline that has always been that way and always will be, which is precisely why it took until the 1970s for anyone to work out that it was a wound. There was no gap on the seafloor with an otter-shaped outline around it. There was rock and urchins and a version of normal that had quietly replaced the old one, while everybody who might have remembered the difference had been dead for 2 generations. That is the lesson buried in 59 animals in wooden crates. An ecosystem is not a list of species. It is a set of relationships, and deleting one does not collapse the system in any obvious way. It reorganizes. It settles into a new arrangement that works and holds and looks entirely natural to whoever shows up next. The kelp forests off Washington are back because someone moved a predator 2,000 miles, partly to get it clear of a nuclear test, and then largely stopped paying attention. The forest did the rest. Nothing had to be rebuilt. One missing piece had to be handed back, and then the water had to be left alone. If you want to see that same logic run the opposite direction, where the answer was taking a species out rather than handing one back, the story of Project Isabella and the goats of the Galapagos is on screen now.